Hello and welcome to this video. My name's Beckham. I've often used satellite navigation as an analogy for our modern photography. Satellite navigation is state-of-the-art technology. But if we're sitting in our car, not knowing where we want to go, it's all rather useless. For it to really fulfill our needs, we need to know our destination. Then it can help us get there. Think of Photoshop or any other image editor you care to name as your satellite navigation. It's useless unless we know where we need to go. What editing does that raw, maybe flat-looking image need? And is it an image that's worth the effort? Unless we know what makes a good image, how can we get to the result we want? If we know where we're going with image editing, but we're perhaps not as skilled in Photoshop as we would like to be, we can persevere and we can find our way to a good result, and as we do, we become more experienced with the software. If we know Photoshop pretty well, but we're not sure what editing the image needs, we're going nowhere. The point I'm clumsily trying to make here is that understanding what makes a good image is a skill we must learn. We need that at the button press stage too. But quite often we can get fixated on technical camera operation and spend too much time trying to fix images in Photoshop that are really beyond fixing. What does this image have to offer? At first glance, it looks flat, boring, and lifeless. Now, I think this image has quite a lot going for it. The first thing it has is very good composition. Now, as we start to view this image, I think we start looking at the image about here. But then we move towards the left, but we've got that row of rocks which stop us from drifting out of the screen. So we tend then to go around the middle and we're led right through to the horizon. Now when we get to the horizon, we've got a storm cloud. It doesn't look very much yet, but I'm pretty certain we've got all the pixels we need there to add a bit of drama. We've got a little bit of a risk down at the extreme bottom. The image has good detail, but it's a little bit weak, but we can do something about that. As we move through the image, we could leave the image on the left-hand side because we've got some light water there, but we can do something about that too. So I think the image has some good storm clouds at a point that we're led to by the leading lines. I can see those clouds here, but it's quite easy to miss them with a quick look at this thumbnail when it's mixed in with many others. The image here has very good exposure. It's a little to the right, but that's going to be good for our image editing. It's also very sharp from the foreground to the background. And if we look at the camera settings just below the histogram, we can see the settings the author used. 100 ISO, a wide-angle lens, f10, great to capture that foreground to background sharpness, and a 50th of a second, almost certainly taken from a tripod. The wide-angle lens and the slightly lowish viewpoint we're given here means we're looking into the scene rather than the feeling we're looking at a flat image. And that is what makes landscape and seascapes come to life. So to make a start with this image, I'd like to go to my basic tab and just bring up the temperature a little bit. I don't think I want to go too far. If we go too far, I think it gets a little too colourful. Double click any of these sliders and they'll reset. I just need a small amount. And when you're moving these sliders a very small amount, it's a pretty good indication that the changes I'm making are more personal rather than right or wrong. But as we move down to the exposure, we know the image has been exposed to the right. If you look at the clipping warning just at the top right corner of the histogram, you can see that's currently lit up. So I'm going to drop the exposure down. It looks about right to me, somewhere around 75 or 80 should do it, something like that. Then I think we'll go on to the highlights and the shadows, because we can drop the highlights down. We can push the shadows up. It's going to affect the foreground, but it's going to affect the rocks as well. So we've got some nice detail there. I think I'll go now to the whites, and we can step the whites a little bit to the right, because if we move the whites to the right and the blacks to the left, what we tend to do is to increase contrast while we're giving the image a bit of sparkle. We don't want too much, something like that. There's a clipping warning come on at the top right when I go a little bit too far, but it's really negligible. Nothing to worry about unless we go massively too far, and of course we don't want to do that. So somewhere around 20, 21, and a little bit down on the blacks too. If we have the clipping warning come on with the blacks, what you'll find is it's much more or much easier to accept that than it is to deal with highlights that are blown out. Blocked shadows seem to be a little bit easier on the eye, but we don't actually need too much. A little bit of clarity, mid-tone contrast, and maybe a little touch of vibrance, but not too much. But then we need to stop and take stock. Because what I tend to do when I'm editing images like this is to say to myself, well, what is the weakest part of the image? And I'll deal with that next. Well, that's the left-hand third, I would say. It's a bit brighter than the rest. And the obvious way to deal with that is with a graduated filter. So selecting that from the toolbox on the right-hand side, move over to the left-hand side, click and drag just over halfway. I'm going to move into the bounding box, right click and reset it. And I'm also going to touch the V key just to hide that bounding box. Now I can go back to my exposure here and I can drop that down a little bit, maybe the highlights down a bit. And you can see we're making a nice change to that left hand side. We need that to be slightly darker because I don't want our attention to be taken along the water and along this edge or this edge. So the next thing we may want to look at is the bottom of the image. I think that needs a bit of shading too. So while we've got those settings selected, if I go down the bottom, I'll touch the V key to bring back the selection, because now I'm going to bring one up from the bottom. Just click and drag up. If it floats around a bit too much for you, move away from the center point and you'll find it's much easier to adjust. Again, I've got too much here, too much darkening of that foreground, so I'll just double click to reset those two. It seems quicker than going into the bounding box, and just add in a little bit of darkness. Maybe I'll let that drift up a little bit further. Again, more personal than anything else. I'd like to bring a little bit of light through on the rocks there, but maybe we'll see how they look once we've dealt with the sky, because the sky is the next thing we need to deal with. Now, in normal circumstances, we would go to the graduated filter and we would apply that to the sky, and there's no problem with doing that. But I'd like to just deviate a little bit and show another technique which I've demonstrated many times before, but I do quite like it myself. But just before we leave this image, I think it may be a good idea if I just hold the control key, click and drag to get the image to about 200%. Just looking at the noise in the sky and the foreground, it doesn't look too bad at all, but I think I'll go back to my Basic tab and then to the detail option and just bring up a little bit of noise reduction. Look at the difference that makes, and I think we could get away with about 20. We don't want to make it too smooth, but to take a little bit of noise away, that's fine. So what I'm going to do is open this up into Photoshop as a smart object. With the image opened up into Photoshop, I can see that I've got a smart object here by the little symbol at the bottom right corner of the thumbnail. All that means is I can double click that thumbnail and have this image back open in Camera Raw to make as many changes as I wish. But what I'd like to do here is to make a duplicate of this and adjust the sky separately. Now, if I just hit Ctrl J, then I'm going to get two identical images, but they're both going to be tied together. In other words, if I double click one and make an adjustment in Camera Raw, it'll affect both. But if I move my cursor to the right of the thumbnail, right click and choose New Smart Object via Copy, I've got exactly the same thing here now, two versions, but they have been separated in relation to Adobe Camera Raw, so I can adjust either one of these individually. I'm going to select the bottom of the two, double click, and we'll open this back up into Camera Raw. So now I'm going to lean on that sky as heavily as I possibly can. I'm going to drop down the exposure quite a bit. I may even bring up the temperature just a little bit, just to take some of that blue away from the cloud, although I don't want to take too much because that's telling us we've got a storm cloud there. I'd like to maybe increase the clarity. That's not doing a great deal. Let's try a bit of dehaze. That's helping quite a bit. What I may also do is, while I'm back into Camera Raw, pick up my adjustment brush. Maybe I'll look at the flow, which is set quite low, but I want it even lower than that. I'm going to reset the exposure. I'd like to just lift that a little bit, just to see if I could give... See, as I touched the image there, I could see instantly that I've got too much exposure. Two choices. I can either drop the flow so it's more measured, but we're already fairly low. So let's drop the exposure. Just a little bit, just to put a bit of light in that cloud. Just to try and enhance the sky just a little bit. We've got a little bit of light right in the background there. Let's see if we can just touch that gently. And while I'm here, maybe I'll just have a little go at the water there. Just lifting that a little bit so that as our interest in this image starts to get to that point, that maybe it'll take us around and to the storm clouds. Sometimes I want the top of my sky a little darker, so I will use a graduated filter for that, selecting that from the right. Click and drag just a little way down. I'll drop the exposure just a touch. Let's take a look at that by clicking OK. And it'll adjust this particular layer, but of course it's hidden at the moment by this one here. So there's the sky that I quite like. There's the foreground that I like. All we've got to do now is mix the two. Select the top layer and apply a layer mask. With the mask selected, we're going to go over to the toolbox on the left hand side. I'm going to pick up my gradient tool, and from the color options I want black as my foreground color. From the options at the top of the screen, I need this option here in the basics, which is foreground to transparent. We already had it selected, but that's where we'll find it in the basics there. So now I can draw a line to determine where the gradient starts and ends. The gradient is on a mask, so it's going to allow the sky from the layer beneath to show through. Much better to demonstrate than explain, so let me give it a try. That's what I had in mind. Now, sometimes we don't always get this right. We've got Ctrl Z to undo that if we want to have another go. And of course we can always dump the mask and reapply it and have another go that way. I think I'll go a little bit further up and just come down not quite so far. That doesn't look too bad at all. But that sky now is looking quite impressive, but it's a little bit unbalanced with the foreground. I could have done with this slightly darker, but of course I didn't know that at the time that I created it. But I've got the layer here and it's a smart object. So if I double click and I go back to my gradient tool, then I should be able to do a little tweak there. Take it down a little bit darker and OK that. See what I mean? We've got a little bit more of a balance there now. But once again, I lighten this area, but maybe most of the image we're seeing is this one here. See what I mean? So what we could do is maybe I'll open that again. Double click. What I could do here now is pick up my brush. Going to bring up that exposure just a little bit. And maybe I can just enhance that lightness around that area there. Maybe a little more. Maybe I'll just bring up the shadows a little bit. So I want to come through here and then into this area here just to lighten that a little, because that's the area I want people to find their way through to that cloud in the distance there. Let's try that. They're the sort of things I think which are purely personal, and it's part of the fun, I think, of working with Photoshop. Now with the spinning round of the image, I've tried to speed up the process just a little bit. I did take my image back into Camera Raw and lighten the rocks a little bit, but using the adjustment brush, same techniques as we've demonstrated so far. And then I've used the option at the top right of the layers to flatten those two layers to move on from this point, but not before I saved my Photoshop file. So on my computer I do have a 2-layer file saved with smart objects and a mask. So if I see something tomorrow morning which I think that I've badly missed, I could go back to that file and open it up and move off in a slightly different direction. What we've got here is 1 or 2 highlights in the sky, which I think we need to deal with. For that, I'm going to use Content Aware Fill as long as it does the job that I would like it to do. So let's give it a try. I'm going to select my lasso tool. I'll select that one right at the top first of all, and we'll try that by going to Edit, Content Aware Fill. Now the image on the left is where we're taking the repair from. The image on the right is the repair. So if we look at this and we're happy with what's been done, then I could just click OK and open this up. I can open it up to a current layer, or I can add a new layer or a duplicate layer. I think I'm pretty happy here to open this up as the current layer. So I'm just going to click OK. Hit Ctrl D and we can take a look, and that looks okay. There's quite a light spot up on the right hand side, so let's go around that. In fact, I'll add to that those 2 little bits there. Not too much to worry about, but let's do it while we're using that Content Aware Fill. I can't even see where the actual repair is. I think it's there. It looks pretty good. So once again, I'm going to do exactly the same as I've just done with all of the highlights here. Except the one right down here, I'll probably just burn that in. So I'll leave that for a few moments. Now with the spinning round of the screen, I've done a little work on the highlights on the left. I've finished off the sky. I'm going to leave that streak of white in the middle to the left because that's more or less where we're drawing the eye. There's a little mark in the sky up there which I don't care for too much. It looks almost like a mistake, so I'll pick up the spot healing brush and give that a couple of touches. I've also straightened the horizon just a little bit, which perhaps I should have done while we had this in Camera Raw, but that's not a great problem. So I've done a little bit of darkening of the clouds in certain areas using the dodge and burn tools, but nothing really significant. What I'd like to do next though is to vignette the edge. To do that, I'm going to select my freehand lasso tool. going to draw a freehand lasso shape right the way around the outer edge. Control-Shift-I will inverse that selection. Then if we go to select and mask at the top of the screen, I need a feather here somewhere up to 450 pixels, and I'm going to output this to a selection, as you can see right down the bottom there. I'm going to hide that selection with Control H and bring up my levels. You'll find them in your image menu, but Control L is a good shortcut, because what I want to do here is just give a touch to those edges. Look at the difference that makes. It's such a small thing, but what a difference. Not forgetting though that you do have a selection in place, so hit Control D to remove that. Finally, I may decide to just elongate my image a bit, give it a little bit more of a panoramic look. If I choose to do that, I'll go to my image menu and image size. I will uncheck the width and height by just clicking the chain link. Then I'll add about 400 pixels onto that. Let's call that 5.4, we'll say 5.8. So I'll increase that to 5.800. As I click OK, you'll see the change. That's looking pretty good to me. If you've watched previous videos of mine, you may have heard me say that I like to take my images as far as I can possibly take them from an image editing point of view. But I have to admit these days that there are one or two filter systems that sometimes can just take my images that one little step further. So when I finish an image like this, I generally just take a quick look. Here's one example. I'm going to go to my filters at the top of the screen, and I'm going to choose the Nick collection, but here I'm going for the Color Effects Pro 4. Now I think the filter that I want is going to be selected automatically because it's the one I generally go to. Judging by what I'm seeing on screen, I think we've already got it. It's tonal contrast down at the bottom. Now, to give you an idea of the difference this is making, if I go to the compare option and click, there's the one that I created and I was happy with that. But look at the difference that that's making to the image. It's just bringing out that tiny bit more contrast and impact. Now we can make changes on the right hand side, so if we felt this was adding a little too much saturation, we can make that adjustment. But I think I'll just click OK here, open this up into Photoshop, and I'll evaluate it there. Now as you can see by the layers on the right hand side, the Nick filters doesn't apply the filter effect to the original image. It creates a duplicate and applies the filter there, which gives us the opportunity here to take a look at the before and after. And of course, if we wanted to make an adjustment to this one, we could always make another copy. Let's just take a look at the saturation. I'm going to bring up my hue and saturation with Control U, because the only thing I was thinking of is maybe a little bit of the saturation off. Not much. Let's take a look at the before and after. Maybe a little more. Before and after. That's a little bit better. Now as we look at the original image and we try to imagine this as one thumbnail amongst hundreds on the screen, you can see why I was saying that knowing exactly where we need to go with the image editing is important. Because if we know where to go, we can take our images from what you see here, which is a raw file and it needs quite a bit of image editing, but nothing overly difficult to arrive at something like this. We're all going to choose something slightly different, and I think this sort of image would also work very well if you decided to make it a monochrome. But if I was going to do that, I would take it through Adobe Camera Raw as a monochrome, what I tend to do these days, or not do these days, is to create a colour image and then start to think about changing it to a monochrome. I'd like to manipulate right from the start as a monochrome image. So one last look at that original and back to the image we created. And we can zoom in a little bit just to reassure ourselves that we do have quite a nice bit of image quality here. We can just about see a little bit of noise coming through now at 100%, but that's fine. If we smooth the image too much, it starts to look unnatural. I'll see you next time.